Good afternoon all. So welcome to the second in a school of education series of Thursday lunchtime seminars. You're blessed here with not one introduction but two introductions, because I have to confess a complete and utter state of ignorance when it comes to things like interdisciplinary, inquiry, pedagogy and teachers. I have no idea what any of that means, but I'm very pleased to welcome our guests all the way from the US who are going to hopefully enlighten us and entertain us with that.
We'll endarken you.
Oh, in darkness, yeah. Well, you're in the right room for that. We live in the dark in this space.
This wonderful building.
So without further ado, I shall pass
Yeah, and I just to add one thing. When you were coming early, and one of the reasons you were coming early was for me to find out biographies and things, exciting things to say, and I forgot. So I won't be saying much exciting things, except Michael and I met originally in the United States at a conference or whatever, and then we met a couple of years later, 2 or 3 years later, in Russia at a Vygotsky summer school, which was amazing. And there was a whole crowd of us. One of my sisters was there as well. And Michael, you were the only one from the US. It was an international crowd of us. And we had to travel down from Moscow to southern Russia on a train, but we were fourth class. It was disgusting. There were 72 of us in the carriage. There was one toilet, you can imagine. And this took 28 hours. So we've been through a lot, even though, it's almost like saying, you have to live with someone to get to know them. So anyway, but we had a very interesting Vygotskian experience, and then we went again, and you were there the second time as well. So yeah, we've had a good history. Steve and I only met 2 days ago, and Stephen and Michael were colleagues at college, and now they're colleagues again as grown-ups. So, and they're both kind of in science education, but I think today, Stephen is going to talk about inquiry and social science, and Michael's going to talk about inquiry and science and the interdisciplinary, and I'll leave them to describe the rest. Okay,
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the frustration we felt over a number of years trying to get our pre-service elementary teachers to do inquiry pedagogy as they become beginning teachers. It's really easy to talk about doing inquiry. We do things in our methods class, and then they go out and they get nervous and they start teaching direct teach from the textbook. Mm-hmm. So what we had an opportunity. Well, Steve, you want to put this on?
You want me to do this? Okay,
Yeah.
so Dewey, who wrote about the history of science education in the U.S. In the late 80s, early 90s, said a single word had to be chosen. That word would have to be inquiry. And we agree. It's still, everybody talks about teaching through inquiry methodologies. Everybody talks about using inquiry pedagogy. Everybody talks about having students explore and construct the world. So it's obviously been critically important, at least for Dewey since the late 50s, but obviously it happened way before that. So we thought, well, this is something our kids should be able to do. So we thought we could make several assertions. We believe this to be a strong pedagogical approach. We firmly believe in inquiry as a methodology, both for teaching and for our students to use as teachers. We also use those strategies when we prepare our teachers. So we require them to go through inquiries into certain experiences, to be thoughtful, to plan, and to reflect on then what happened when they tried what they were going to try. So to be experimenters with their own practice.
And throughout our program and many across the world, the idea of reflective practitioner fits in really well with them inquiring about their own practice.
And we also know that it doesn't work. That even though we try to get our teachers to do that, when they get into schools, it's very challenging for them to use inquiry as a methodology to help any age student learn. And that's what's been baffling us for a long time. We believe in it, we want to use it, we want them to use it, and we practice it, and then they graduate, they go out into classrooms, and we go and launch, and it's very much direct instruction. So what we wanted to know, could we reverse that? Could we kind of prolong the love of inquiry in them over time? And that's sort of what led to this project that we collaborated on.
And the culture in schools in the States with the high stakes testing, as we know in many other countries, is moving away from inquiry and towards a reductionist view of the curriculum and direct teaching.
So inquiry has very deep roots, goes way back, starts with Hume, right? Dewey was critical in the United States of getting people to think of experiential education through inquiry. For a long time, the progressive movement used an inquiry sort of approach, although for some reason teachers never got it then either. In the 60s, Schwab wrote a book called The Teaching of Sciences Inquiry. He was at the University of Chicago, and he had a really interesting idea about inquiry. He talked about two kinds. There's stable inquiry, which happens when you're sitting down and planning, because you have nothing happening, you're just doing, and then there's what happens when things start moving. You move into fluid inquiry. And fluid inquiry is like what happens if you played a game. You know, let's talk about the plays beforehand, but then you get on the field and it becomes very active and moving. So he talked about those are very different. You work very differently if you're in a stable inquiry model versus a fluid inquiry model. And I think that informs what happens to our teachers. We teach them in a very stable way. They get into classrooms, it's a very fluid environment, and it doesn't work the same. So they have trouble translating them. And so more recently, inquiry, people have been trying to make inquiry work forever, and they're still working on it. And this was in Korean schools. Kim and Chin tried to get their teachers to use inquiry because in Korean schools, direct instruction is a critical sort of approach they use where everybody's, it's really a recovery of the content that the teacher provides. So the teachers struggled because even though they were supported to do this, they didn't want to take any risks to show that they didn't know the content themselves. So the teachers got afraid and weren't able to use inquiry in their classrooms. There was no model for experimentation in the schools when they got there. So there's very little support.
And risk-taking was not encouraged.
And risk-taking was not encouraged. And the students didn't want to take risks either. You know, don't make me do something where I don't know the answer, because I'm here to pass the test.
Can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
So in physics, where I'm from, we're always told, you know, why can't we just lift? It's always said Korean textbooks when we want to teach maths and physics. Now, I don't agree, because I don't think there is an element of risk and of creativity in those books. So what do I say to my head of school when he says, can we not just lift the Korean book?
Well, I don't think what they're trying to fight with this study was the fact that there is no creativity in the teaching. That the students are just asked to regurgitate the known facts, and the students are very comfortable with that.
Also, the international studies on science math that Jim Stiegler did, his conclusion looking at multiple high-performing countries is that there is no single best practice, that it comes down to the engagement of students in a culturally connected way, so whatever works in that culture or that country to cognitively engage the students, and that's going to vary from country to country.
And because there is a very strong tradition of direct instruction, the teachers, the students who are learning to be teachers felt very uncomfortable stepping out of that role as providers of direct instruction. When they had to pose questions that were open-ended, the students got confused, they got confused. It didn't seem to translate very well. So it's not just in the US that we've had this problem or anywhere else. It's everywhere. It seems to be a broad problem to step outside.
There's a funny little story that Stiegler talks about in LA at the UCLA lab school, where a teacher had been looking at a Japanese math class and wanted to teach like that and started to do it, and it didn't work. So then she showed the kids a video of what the Japanese kids do, and then they were like playing this role of being a Japanese kid, and then all of a sudden it worked much better.
Wasn't there another slide?
That's fair.
Okay.
Maybe it's after this one.
Okay, so Winchell is a science educator in the US, and he thought, he's had trouble with inquiry as well. He teaches graduate students who have degrees in science, natural science,
Becoming
who are going to
science
become
teachers.
secondary teachers, high school teachers. And he thought, well, these people know about inquiry. They've been through, some of them have worked in laboratories, they've worked on experimental projects, they have a much better understanding of inquiry as a process, scientific inquiry. And so he tried to get them through direct instruction to practice inquiry in their classrooms. And guess what? It didn't work there either. So even people who have a strong background in scientific inquiry processes aren't able to translate that into working with learners in a classroom. And John and McDonald found that because inquiry is messy, often teachers get a little afraid in the middle and they quit. That it gets a little bit out of control. The horses start going a little wild. They don't know exactly what's going to happen next, and they say, "Okay, well, let me tell you what we're supposed to be learning here." And they give them the answers, and then they proceed through a direct instruction. So, how many of you have been in classrooms at K-12 or? So maybe you've seen that happen where the teacher starts off with a good intention, but once it gets a little wild, they back off that and they go to the safe zone of, okay, now get out of your books. Which is what we're going to do.
No, that's what you need. That's quoting.
So a lot of people have been trying to do this with very little success. So we thought, I don't know that we hoped we could be more successful, but we thought we could give it a try and kind of poke at this a little bit ourselves with our students. And so we started thinking about this idea of inquiry pedagogy. You
Finish on this and then I'll start
So-
going about what we did.
So DeWitt sort of defined an idea of inquiry pedagogy. So how do you teach people to do inquiry? And these are the attributes. And it looks a lot like a scientific inquiry. It looks a lot like a historical inquiry, and that's what drew us to it. Is it fits a lot of definitions. It's a cyclical process where you have a problem, the answer is unknown to the students, to the inquirers. Nobody knows, they're not sure they know the answer. They argue a little bit about what might be a good answer, and then they start collecting some data to find out if any data matches sort of their idea of a good answer or what a hypothesis might be. They analyze that, then they talk. The discourse focuses on relationships between the problem they defined, the hypothesis they have, and the data. So as the data support the hypothesis need revision, is the problem a problem? But eventually they develop a hypothesis that's warranted by the data, and then they share that hypothesis. So that's sort of an inquiry pedagogy, and if you can get students to do that in your classroom, they're learning through an inquiry model. And this made it really clear to us because the way both of us teach is roughly following this model. So.
Okay, so what did we do to try to push the inquiry pedagogy with our students? Stephen teaches an elementary social studies methods class. I teach an elementary science methods class. We decided to block the two classes. So Stephen's going to be doing historical inquiry in his class. I'm doing investigation and scientific inquiry in mine. At the same time, we are engaging our students with Japanese lesson study as a way of inquiring about their own teaching. And we have a placement at an IB school, International Baccalaureate School, and their elementary accreditation is based on them implementing the elementary program, which is an inquiry-based approach to their content. So we thought if we come at this from all these angles, maybe they have a chance of wrapping around and pushing forward in their inquiry. In my classroom, I use a model for teaching science called Investigation Colloquium Method, which nobody knows about. It was in Russia. I shared it. A woman named Brenda Lansdowne in the 50s started teaching just sort of instinctively, seeing the importance of kids debating and talking about ideas that they're going to understand. And then when Vygotsky published Thought and Language, she was one of the first educators in the US to take that and create an instructional model based on Vygotsky's work with the connection of thought and language. And in '71, published this book. One of her students, George Tokiata, was a mentor of mine when I was getting my master's, and he introduced creative drama and sort of the idea of make-believe into that, which is another idea of Vygotsky's in terms of helping kids move beyond where they are through the imagination. So that model very specifically looks at how you select materials based on the concepts you're trying to learn that engages the kids in debate and discussion and prompts them to have ownership of their questions and then move forward with their discussion to make sense and come to some conclusions. And then Stephen's class.
Anybody recognize the picture? Anybody recognize the picture? Anybody know, you know where we're from, don't y'all? Texas, so what's famous in Texas? Who's the guy in the middle with the...
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett! And where's he fighting?
The Alamo.
At the Alamo. So good, so we can lead you through no conclusions. So we could say, who painted this picture and how do they know what happened? Because anybody who lived through it, you know, was on the Mexican side. So it'd be a little hard to paint from the hero of Davy Crockett's vision, but somebody envisioned it. Anyway, teaching historical inquiry is to teach students to challenge sort of the known conclusions of historical presentation. In Texas, we live large with the memory of the Alamo. It's a mythology. I'm sure you have them here too, don't you? I mean, you know, old myths
About
die
800
hard.
years of them, yeah.
The Alamo isn't even an old myth. It's grown. It grows by leaps and bounds every day with every new movie. But the idea of historical inquiry is to challenge, to get kids to challenge sort of competing claims and to understand, well, how do you value this competition? How do you learn to sort of find some common ground and answer questions for which there is no answer, really, because historical inquiry is inquiring into the past. So there's no definitive answers, there's just good arguments that set it up. So you're trying to get them to actually to reach informed decisions by assessing evidence. And so that's a natural for an inquiry model. And
What about your primary source project?
what we're doing in my class is we're using primary sources in the library on Texas history to investigate sort of the mythology of Texas's past. So there's some wonderful journals from people who immigrated to Texas at the time of the Revolution and told stories that are contradictory sort of to the known legend, the authentic legend of the Alamo. So using that, they present kids with choices, trying to figure out, well, who do you listen to? Do you listen to this person who was hysterical and obviously had people who died, or do you listen to this person who was on the Mexican side who may have been a little less hysterical after the battle? And how do you weigh those different pieces of evidence? So that's our historical inquiry piece. There's some really interesting stuff comes up when you start looking at primary sources in a state's history. So,
Oops. I accidentally,
you just
thank you.
any historians in here?
No, John's not here. We have, I don't know, John is. We have a historian, but he's not.
Okay.
Oh, so it keeps cooking out here.
You're doing it.
Yeah.
I am. Should I try it again here?
Yeah.
I think I may be blocking the. No.
Keep going. We can keep going.
Yeah. Is it?
Who needs slides?
Oh, well. Can you click down to the next one?
Let me see if that was on the keyboard.
Yeah, we can just do the keyboard.
Yeah.
You want me to just click the keyboard here while we do it?
I don't know, it seems to be reverting back to...
Has anybody been to the Alamo?
Yes,
Oh, you have.
I have an answer.
Oh, did you go to the basement? That's
Is it going to get to the next slide?
There is no
We can do it in this level too. Just
See, when I say view...
Can we use the arrow key down now?
Oh, I see what you mean, yeah.
Here, we can just do it like this.
Debunking of the
Absolutely.
mythology.
Absolutely. You know, people
Okay.
don't want to go
This is where we need.
to contradict sort of.
We'll just do it like this, it's fine.
Construction, you bet. And when you tell people that maybe, isn't it amazing that Davy Crockett was at the battle when he had to come all the way from Kentucky?
Just remind us
You know,
what
it
to
took
say.
him 3
It's fine.
months to get there.
Just trying to get
How
the
did
screen
you
so
know
it gets all the words in.
Oh,
get there because
that's
there was
okay.
no like sign battle this way 3 months from now, you know. But somehow he knew to come down, and they brought Kamen with them. I mean, it was, and then they met the Mexicans coming up, and it was, you wonder how those things happened. It sounds like they were sort of there, and the Mexicans
it's
attacked
fine.
them, but
Sure.
actually it was a carefully kind of orchestrated dance. And people don't want to hear that. They want to hear, well, they were there, they were fighting for independence.
Beautiful.
You can meet powerful opposition in that.
You get a lot of, there's students who say, you know, Texas can still secede because we're so
What's that?
special, we can leave the
Yeah.
country. And say,
Yeah, that's where
we tried
that's
it
where we
once,
wanna be.
you know, the Civil War. And,
Okay, I think we got this working now. So I'm wondering how many of you have ever heard of Japanese lesson study, or a couple of you have?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a professional development model in Japan that's widely used. It's taken taken off in the US on some level, a lot of lesson study programs around the country. We are reading that in the UK, it's starting to take off a little bit too. What it is, it's a process where a team of teachers jointly plan a lesson, and then they go into one of the teacher's classroom and they teach the lesson to that teacher's students. That one teacher teaches it, and everybody else, instead of watching the teacher teach it, is watching the students, because they have clarified what they want this lesson to do for their kiddos in the classroom. So everybody else on the team is really closely watching the kids, and the idea is that it's going to be data on their instructional decisions, not on the person teaching. And Steve and I have done that on our own teaching. I've done a project on my campus where I've worked with other faculty members in doing lesson study. I did with the astronomy professor, we did a cratering lab where it's looking at energy and size of craters. Did a biology one where they were looking at writing in biology for publication and had to help students through that and what they did. We did one where we, with people from other campuses, you were at Hawaii at that time. So Stephen was in Hawaii, we had people from 5 different universities, and we all taught a class at our own university and came to visit each other while we were teaching it. And then it ended with us teaching the same lesson at a science ed conference to real undergraduate students, with the audience being more data collectors. And it was really kind of a marvelous thing. But we've also found that it works beautifully with pre-service teachers, because it quickly shifts the conversation from how did I do, what did I do wrong, what did I do right, to these students didn't learn what I thought they would learn. The material, it really messed up when we handed out the materials that way. How can we change it? And it really switches the thought that the students are doing to the outcomes of the students. It also has changed my role as a supervisor a little bit. And often, instead of going when I'm observing a student, instead of saying, okay, these are what I'm going to be watching for, what do you need me to look at? What do you want me to watch? Which kids are you worried about? What part of the lesson are you struggling with? And so it sort of pushed me to a little different power relationship with my students. And contrasting, and probably this won't come as a surprise, but in traditional professional development, usually an expert comes in, has the answer, the communication flow is from the expert to the teacher. There's a hierarchical relationship, and research that brilliant people like us have done informs the practice. Whereas in lesson study, begins with a question. So ideally, we prompt a little bit with our pre-service teachers, but ideally teachers say, okay, we're struggling with this, they don't work well in groups. They have trouble understanding force and motion. Whatever it is that you're trying to work on. So it's driven by the participating teachers. The communication flow is teacher to teacher, reciprocal relations, and the actual practice is the research.
So this fits in nicely with those inquiry attributes, with starting with a question and then making some guesses about what's going to work, or informed guesses, and then actually collecting data on did it work, and then analyzing the data and thinking how would we manipulate the process to make it work better, and then sharing that, because a big part of Japanese lesson study is a public sharing of your outcomes, which is very different from teacher consultation, where you say, I'm not going to tell anybody, but you did really well.
This is just a graphic from Catherine Lewis, who is one of the people in the U.S. who went to Japan for a year and studied Japanese early education, and also has written some books on lesson study and looks at the kind of iterative process of lesson study. So again, this is what I've already shared about the steps you go through when you're doing lesson study. And then one of the things that we feel are really powerful is the reteaching of it and the replanning in terms of getting the students thinking about what's happening with their students instead of what's happening with them. This is when we did our own lesson study and ended up at that conference. Do you want to take this, Stephen?
So I don't know what that top line with the red line.
That's because there's no space between the colon and
Okay. Well, we found 3 things, so I don't know what that one is, but there's a critical role of the support they receive from the cooperating teachers. Because we're in an IB school, the teachers understand the inquiry process a little bit better. When we're in public schools that are not IB focused, the teachers really struggle with how much time it's going to take to have kids explore anything. So if you take 30 minutes to have them do an initial exploration and then start developing some hypotheses and then do some more exploration, the teachers are going, this took way too long for this simple idea. But in the IB, they're willing to do that. They're willing to let them do progressively in different classes, study the same lesson in different classes. They're willing to work with them to understand the process and to give them feedback. So they found that support was very helpful for them in doing this process, and we did too. This year we have a great group of teachers who are working with a team of students, and suddenly they're emailing us with ideas, the teachers saying, can we have them do this? Can we have them do that? We're going to absolutely talk to them about it, but what's nice is it's not, the teachers aren't disconnected from the process of having a student teach in their classroom. And as university educators, I think that happens quite a bit. We have a demand for the student to do certain things. They go into the classroom, the teacher says, "You're having you do what this year?" That's really strange.
and maybe we're not doing anything important on Thursday, so you can have that day to do your assignment.
Thursday afternoon after the recess, you can have some free time to have them play. But they found that this support of the teachers was critical. They also found that they deepened their understandings of content. And one of the stories from last year was these 2 elementary students teachers were doing a lesson on Galileo and Newton all in one afternoon. And they were studying force and gravity,
Gravitational acceleration.
and gravitational acceleration and mass and every other word you could think of that relates to those 2. And one of our students didn't have a very good grip on any of it. Acceleration, speed, weight, all mass, whatever, all those things she didn't know. And as she went through the lesson, it was obvious she struggled, to help the kids understand it. And afterwards she said, I need to learn this stuff. It was duh. But what was interesting was it's from her. That's her own critique. Whereas usually it's our critique of them. In a classic sense, we'd be saying you just didn't get the content right. But they knew it and they got to fix that content. So the second time they went, they understood those terms and they anticipated the students' questions. But they had a teacher talk about the messy zone. They had a teacher in one of those classrooms told the kids to stand on the table and drop. They had a big marshmallow, a big actual marshmallow. You could cook it. This is a big one, and a little bag of marbles. And she had the kids stand up on the table and drop the 2. To repeat Galileo. And the kids were fascinated by it, but the students were, what are they doing? Get them off the table. That's irresponsible. We can't have that happen. But the teacher had encouraged them to get up there and do that. So this deepening understanding of the complex nature of the content. And finally, this power of ongoing reflection. We interviewed the students at the end of the year, and they were still processing the experience. It wasn't like they had processed it to death and they had a conclusion they could recite. They said, when I first did this, I thought this, and then later I thought this, but you know what, now I think this. And it was interesting to hear them continue to keep this as an active sort of learning experience in their own minds, and I think that was a really important.
Yeah, it was really fun to hear them, even in the interviews, making the connection between the lesson study and our classes and what was happening in the classroom. It was definitely emerging and this was their junior year, so they had one more year field placements and student teaching.
And then two of them went to a conference with us in San Antonio after the class was over. And they spoke to the conference about that process. And we were learning from them still then that, they had really had a deep experience. So, and these are juniors, so it's 20-year-olds.
It's not doing anything anymore, but here, maybe I can just. Oh well. Yeah, see, they're just like 2 more slides, I think. Good.
Okay.
Good. So, we do believe that it's possible to help these pre-service teachers gain more insight and experience with inquiry pedagogy, but it's still not easy. It takes time, and you have to give them the time and the space and the support to do that. And while doing that, we feel like we made some success in helping them think theoretically about what they're doing. And as watching the kids in their lesson and reflecting on that and collecting data, they are making connections to theories of teaching and learning.
They're certainly learning that active engagement matters with the kids because they feel the difference and they're all watching, so they see the difference when they're being sort of giving the instructions versus having the kids, okay, now go do the experiment. And they're amazed at how the kids jump into the inquiry themselves, and they're going, wow, they were really excited, weren't they? They're sort of surprised by that.
And we'll leave these with Colette if anybody's interested. Again, we have found that the lesson study process is a really powerful way to structure the student's own inquiry and their own teaching. If anybody's interested, there are plenty of resources online. So,
you want you to come with us on Monday to the school in Austin, Texas.
in Round Rock, Texas.
They're actually going to teach the lesson. Now we're here, so they're planning.
They've been emailing us.
They've been emailing with
This is what we're
questions,
thinking of doing.
It's nice that we're not there to kind of be mother hens, and let them do it. And then they're going to teach on Monday morning 2 different times with a break in between so we can talk about what happened. And then on Wednesday they'll teach again. So they'll teach it a total of 4 times the same lesson, and we're going to watch again what happens. But we're a little nervous with this group because some of them are really eager beavers and others have a lot of questions. So we'll see what happens.
But we're hoping to have some time to hear questions or comments or thoughts for the rest of our time here.
Do you have a sense that it's easier to have inquiry-based learning for certain aspects of science than it is for others? So I'm thinking the difference between very theoretical concepts and extremely applied concepts.
Certainly with young kids, there are some things that you can do that just the materials alone will prompt all kinds of inquiry, and there are other things that are very difficult to set up so that the inquiry is going to be natural and make sense. I would say.
So which of those two do you think does it lean towards either, or is it not that dichotomy at all? So I'm thinking like the concept of gravity versus how a battery works. So charge storage versus concept of force, something that's quite abstract versus something that you can kind of have a sense of what it's about.
Well, I think you can do both those because the things that can be physically represented or happen right in front of the kids, there are always ways to explore that with them. My own work, I've done a lot with creative dramatics, so if I'm doing battery charge, I have a big map of the circuit on the floor and the kids get in the battery and they run through the wires and then they can start talking about what happens when the wire's broken or what happens when there's an easier path to go. And gravity is a little more of a tougher concept because...
It's a heavier thought.
Yeah, it's much heavier thought. You have thoughts on this, Stephen?
Well, I was thinking that actually, I think the idea of inquiry is to push theoretical understandings at the end.
Yeah.
You want to challenge you want to build on the theory. So you don't want to take the theory and then make sure it works and check it off. Okay, I understand. You want to go the other way. use the experiences then to kind of influence the thinking about theory. So that's a lot more complicated, and it's rarely done. I think that piece of the inquiry is often forgotten about. Japanese lesson study in the US has been challenged because the teachers think of it as building a good lesson. That's not a theoretical learning. You're building a good lesson. So, but I think the challenge for them to think is, so theoretically, what am I learning about learning with a good lesson, and how does that change my thinking about teaching and learning rather than my teaching of this lesson?
Yeah.
So does that make sense?
No, it
so
does,
you're
yeah.
pushing it to the theoretical. Now, you can't push young kids to full theories, but you can push them to partial theories and hypotheses that they can test.
I'm
And
thinking of it for undergraduates.
Yeah,
For
and
first years.
undergraduates,
Yeah.
you have trouble pushing them to full theories too.
Absolutely, but I guess there's more of an onus on us to do it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think you have to think of that as an endpoint. So the theoretical connectivity is an endpoint. That they're really trying to build a theoretical understanding of why it went that way.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing that, then you're just doing an activity
Absolutely.
in isolation. And does that answer your question?
It does very nicely, yeah.
And I think that's why a lot of people struggle with how to do inquiry in a classroom, because it becomes about the activity, not about the theory building.
Yeah, I think that I like the struggles that you have in public schools and as opposed to the IB schools where they're based on the principle of inquiry learning. And again, I think we've all suffered this going around doing school supervisions and trying to get students to do something a bit more creative, a bit more exotic in their practice, but they don't, not because they don't want to, it's because the context in which they're working in
Exactly.
shapes their work, forms, structures it in a way which mitigates against doing something interesting, whether it be the other teachers, whether it be the parents, whether it be the students that they're working with, just really don't get it.
Right.
And again, so how have you overcome that one?
Well, I think we went to IB school. We're looking for environments that support that, and there are individual teachers that come along. Now, in secondary school, it's a lot harder because I think it's a lot more difficult because, first of all, there's not as many content teachers. You know, almost all the elementary teach both social studies and science. So you find a good teacher, she can do both, or he can do both. But in secondary, you have to look among all the history teachers, and then they have the school goals and the standards and the tests they're going to give them, and they are frightened about giving you 15 minutes to have a thoughtful discussion. And that's really, it is, I mean, it's one of the pressures we're fighting against all the time is classrooms that are very teacher-oriented, very factual, and not very exciting for kids to be in. You know, the kids are sitting there playing with their iPods, actually, you know, or their
We also have kids now who've grown up with the high-stakes testing environment, so they have no models of a more inquiry approach. So part of our thinking is that at least they have a model that they can take with them into a more traditional setting, and when they have space to do it, they at least know what it looks like.
We also tell our students that there's teaching in what we call the undertow. So you caught, you know, and the current is against you, and you won't win swimming against it. You know, that's death. Swim across it somehow. Find a way to move laterally so that you can get into a better position. And you know, you interview the school when you look for a position because they're very frustrated going out and finding this is what schools do. It's not what I want. It's not what I dreamed of.
Yeah, where one of the things that I have looked at for a long time with the lesson study, and you're right, one of the criticisms is that the teachers involved often stay at the level of the lesson, and the link between what they're doing in the classroom and the theory of what's going on in learning is often not there. And one of the tools that we use here is the co-teaching, in which the student teacher is kind of trained up theoretically and everything to work with the co-op teacher, and they share expertise. So Marita's doing her PhD on this in music education, and we were at a school last week and we asked the teachers what would they really like our students to come in with to help them, so that it's a deal. And in secondary as well, because in secondary sometimes the science teachers or the music teachers think they're the experts anyway. and they can't see that the student teacher might be coming in with expertise. So when we asked these teachers in the school, they said assessment for learning and want and will. And that's, we are learning today and what we're looking for, what these I'm looking for will. And for us, they're really easy tools because, we've been teaching about them because it's all to do with our revised curriculum. And the assessment for learning thing is really big. Whereas the teachers in practice in the school, this is just coming into them as something new, and they don't really have much of an idea about it. So in that sense, what happens is the student teacher is upskilled and has the theory of AFL, how it came into being, and all this kind of thing. And so they're going in at an equal level, not as somebody who is down there and the teacher sitting at the back or marking or whatever while they're teaching away. But the whole principle is this idea of kind of sharing practice. And then the next stage of it is that when we're talking about reflection, and you're talking about the student teachers reflecting and the teachers reflecting, having done that for years, I looked at 10 years research of co-teaching, and I could not find any high-level reflection, critical reflection, anything that was really linking theory to practice. It was all surface level, nearly all surface level. So we then tried a new approach where we give them 8 references, Dewey, Vygotsky, all these key people, and they have to write a reflective piece using only those 8 references, nothing more. And some of the references refer to levels of reflection, so from surface up to critical, And then they reflect on their own practice in relation to the levels, so that they are now thinking, they can now see, oh, I'm now reflecting at this level, and all this. So one of the problems I think with reflection is that as a whole profession, we've never really given them good tools in order to reflect. We've expected this quantum leap, and we're disappointed when we don't see it. It's the same with any theory practice thing. I think sometimes we have to walk them into the theory, and they have to know the theory in a way that they can assess themselves in it. And that's what we're doing with the reflection thing. So it's interesting that it's that final bit, and that's what frightens people.
Well, it's the challenge.
Yeah.
I think that's the intellectual challenge. And when you do that, teaching becomes an intellectual act.
Yeah.
And not a minding act. All of a sudden
Yeah.
you're thinking about learners as something that is alive.
Yes.
And that gives them a lot more energy and excitement and connection to the students. So.
We have a question or a comment here.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I was fascinated listening to the lecture, so interesting. But it's just really good to see that the approach for the service, the students are actually looking at how the children learn and what they learn, as opposed to a beautifully planned lesson plan that looks lovely but means nothing and doesn't come from a commitment to learning for the students. But I've actually taught in Texas, and I'm doing a case study with teachers in Texas at the moment, with some private schools and some ISDs. And I love your idea.
What part of Texas?
Houston.
Oh, Houston.
Yeah, I love your idea, but I'm trying to find out how you can incorporate that great team teaching into the ISD environment where they have a special parking space for Teacher of the Month, and there's all the standardised testing. Pressures on teachers now. The private schools have a little more relaxed environment, but in those ISDs, the pressure on teachers to teach to the testing, and even to the extent that the children in lower socioeconomic groups are only allowed access to factual books because the vocabulary from factual books increases their test scores in reading. In that environment.
So long as it includes Ronald Reagan as a fact.
Yeah. In that environment, how can you encompass this wonderful idea?
It is a challenge. Texas Education Agency does talk about lesson study as an approach. The Science and Math Regional Collaboratives, I don't know if you're familiar with them, also have been doing some work in lesson study, so there is some sort of recognition and room from the top that you can say, see, this is something we're supposed to be doing, or we could be supported by doing. so much always depends on the culture of the school and the principal and the teachers. The teachers we've worked with who wanted to found a way of making it happen within their school, sometimes on their own backs, rather than having as much support as they should.
But all I would say is.
But I know, especially in the lower income schools, it's just so hard for teachers to have any kind of autonomy to do that. It's a real challenge and a real problem.
Thank you.
I mean, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking precisely the same thing as I was listening to your talk, which was fascinating. Like, how do you actually produce the goods at test level in the end so that you convince this is the way? So 2 ideas came to me as you were presenting. The first is, I suppose it's the amount of time we spend in the class doing any one thing. So while the class is based on inquiry, at the very beginning when you're teaching the kids the skills of informal learning and inquiry learning and all the rest of it, maybe a small amount of the class is on that and a large amount might be in the traditional way. But that you gradually move towards, but you must have at the end of the class reflection built in for the children. So this is how it's presented at the test. We'll do a little bit of that. So we need to constantly keep our kids' performance in the test in our heads. We just gradually need it. So eventually they see how they can apply what they're doing through inquiry based. That's the first thing. And I think the second is you need to influence those who are testing. So the test needs to include critical thinking, inquiry based learning, that sort of thing as well. And I think that's it, bingo. I mean, am I right or wrong?
We are from Texas, so critical thinking is a big skill.
Yeah.
You and the cow don't need to critically think about what's going to happen. No, I'm just
Yeah.
there. But I agree with you. I think you need to do that. I think one of the problems with the curriculum is we start early, we test quickly, then we reteach because they didn't get it all. So you just keep doing that. You never really think of teaching differently or broadening an idea that takes seed and growing it over time. We don't think of those. We teach fractions starting in 3rd grade, and you teach it again in 4th to those who didn't get it, but they're still teaching it in 9th grade to those who didn't get it yet. So they've had it how many years, and they didn't get, and they never think, how can we do this differently? How can we take this process and make sense of it? Because there's no real models for that. That takes time and energy. Teachers, they just teach it the same way over and over, and the school district approves that because it's the test score that drives them. She mentioned the ISDs in Texas. There's 1,200 independent school districts in Texas. That's a lot. Houston's one of the largest. I think they have, 1.5 million students in Houston. So 1.5 million students.
6 million.
The people that run the testing program make fabulous amount of money.
Yeah.
The teachers who teach the kids, are down there, scrabbling in the classroom looking for books. So the weight is toward testing as a measure of success. And teachers are now devalued. So we're trying to, one thing we want our students to do is not be devalued. And lesson study is a way for them to constantly build value for themselves about their own practice.
One of many ways.
Well, and it was one way. When they watch each other teach, there's a lot of respect happens between people who may not, I'm smarter than you, but wow, you had a really good idea,
And in the U.S., as around the world, it's a political issue. We have an advisory committee that meets twice a year with us, and we have teachers and principals and superintendents come to, start checking with them with our program. Every one of them, up to the superintendent, says that the impact of high-stakes testing in the U.S. is devastating. And they're saying they don't listen to us. It's not until parents start yelling and screaming to politicians that things are going to change. And it's very frustrating because, everybody who's in there knows that this is not healthy or helpful, but hopefully there will be a political shift at some point. How about that?
I suppose I'm interested in the use of lesson study, and it's inescapably associated with its origin as such in Japan. And I wonder, one would assume from its use and its spread that the result of it within the Japanese education system is that there's a system there that's qualitatively different, but more importantly better than other systems. And yet that's a debatable point. There's probably as much criticism that you can level at the Japanese system as praise. And does this inform or your thinking, I suppose, at all in depending and, I suppose, working so closely with lesson study as I don't know if it is as a dominant methodology? Is there an assumption that it has reaped, that the Japanese system has reaped benefit as a
I
result?
think in Japan, lesson study is used predominantly for curriculum development. It's not for learning about teaching. It's for curriculum testing. And because they don't have national testing, national curriculum programs that write, I don't know what you have in Ireland, but in the US, you buy textbooks from textbook companies that have tested the curriculum, and they have the tests all prepared and the whole package comes to you. In Japan, they don't have that. The teachers create the curriculum. So it's a curriculum making process. It's meant to be at the small scale, and good ideas disseminate through the small country pretty fast. So that's the way it's used, not as a way to improve or explore preparing to teach or even how to be a better teacher. It's really meant to explore the curriculum sort of problem. So when a new idea comes along, like the tsunami and nuclear problem, how do you teach that? So they experiment with how to teach that idea, and then that enters the curriculum. And so other teachers copy the way it's taught. Does that make sense? So it's not really the same way we're trying to use it at all. It's really very different. We're trying, to try to use it to learn to teach is a very different set of problems, I think.
There's also some arguments in literature that in Japan it has pushed, at least to the elementary grades where it started being used a lot, to a more student-centered approach to thinking about teaching. So, in that way there is professional development element. And, we see that with our students. It is definitely getting them thinking more about what's happening with their kids as the center of what they're thinking about versus their own role as giver of information.
I'm just conscious of the time here, and we need to finish around about 2, and I just want to thank you for a very stimulating and illuminating discussion. I think one of the things that struck me there, we should all revolt against assessment systems.
Yes.
High stakes, certainly.